Hi, and welcome to this tech brief. My name is Matt Lenny, and I'm the Sales Engineering Manager for Coma Telecom. Today, I will be talking about deploying a public safety DAS in a campus environment and the pros and cons of using a FiberDAS versus using individual BDAs in each building. The specific problem we're looking into today is a campus-type environment. This means multiple buildings, all located very close to each other. These will usually be on the same city block or have only walkways between the buildings instead of roads. The buildings would typically all have the same owner, otherwise coordination for a FiberDAS would become very difficult. There's usually a single good choice for a donor tower, although in some cases you could have multiple donor tower choices. In this example, we are going to have a single choice for a donor tower located on the top left of the screen. And of course, we are only looking at buildings that failed initial ERRCS testing and require a public safety DAS. So the assumption is that all buildings on campus are going to require a DAS either today or eventually. So looking at this, we have 5 buildings within a single campus, and we can deploy 2 different solutions in a traditional architecture. The 2 solutions that come to mind are deploying individual BDAs in each building, as shown on the left side of the screen, or deploying a FiberDAS to cover the full campus, as shown on the right side of the screen. So looking at the left side, if you deploy individual BDAs, each building will have its own donor antenna, its own BDA, and its own passive DAS infrastructure. Nothing is shared between buildings, and each one is sort of a standalone system. So there's no communication between the BDAs and the individual buildings. They do not share any alarms together. There would be a dedicated FACP or remote annunciator for each BDA in each building. And any commissioning would take place in one building at a time. So you would need to visit buildings 1 through 5 in order of construction in order to fully deploy the system. If you deploy a FiberDAS, you would choose one building to have a donor antenna and master unit. So in this example, building 1, this would typically be the first building constructed or the first building that requires a public safety DAS. But if you have a choice, it should be the best location for the donor antenna. So in this case, building 1 is located closest to the donor antenna, so we would choose building 1 to be our head end. So building 1 would contain the master unit and a remote unit as well as its own passive DAS, and then there would be underground fiber to each of the other 4 buildings. So building 1 would feed to building 2, and building 1 would also feed to buildings 3, 4, and 5. These can be daisy-chained fiber, but each one would typically require its own dedicated strand, or you can do a dedicated home run to each building. So it just depends on how you can deploy it and what pathways might exist between buildings. So all system controls in this case would take place in building 1 at the master unit, and only building 1 would have the donor antenna on the roof. Buildings 2, 3, 4, and 5 would each have their own remote unit, battery backup, passive DAS, and then the alarming in this case is flexible. You can alarm it so each building has its own remote annunciator talking about itself and its own communication to building 1, or you can have one overall annunciator in building 1 that covers all 5 buildings. So this will always be done per local code. So there's no one set way to do this, and the FiberDAS would be flexible in terms of deployment. So taking a closer look at the individual BDA deployment. The image on this slide shows what the system would look like with individual BDAs deployed in each building. In this 5-building scenario, we have building 1 and building 3 both have direct line of sight to the donor tower. Buildings 2, 4, and 5 all have their line of sight fully or partially blocked by building 1. So with 5 BDAs, assuming all BDAs have the same noise floor, this setup would have a minimum of a 7 dB noise floor increase as compared to a single BDA, but that number could be much higher depending on how it's commissioned and deployed. So some of the potential issues that can occur include building 1 retransmitting the uplink signal from buildings 2, 4, or 5, or there could be oscillation between the buildings. So when properly commissioned, it's easy to avoid all potential issues that could arise, but it's important to understand beforehand what can occur. And understanding beforehand what can occur is the responsibility of both the system integrator and the building owner. The building owner should be able to reach out to a system integrator and send all these buildings out as a single RFP rather than getting the lowest price per building. Because when you bid it out per building, you're going to end up with BDA only systems. And bidding it out per building, you could have 5 different system integrators, each unaware that there's a system in one of the other buildings. And in that case, they wouldn't know that they need to account for possible interference between the buildings. So let's take a look at the repeated signal that could happen through building 1. So based on the layout of these buildings, it's possible that any uplink signal out of the donor antenna on top of building 2, 4, or 5 can be picked up by an interior antenna in building 1, especially if building 1 has service antennas located very close to the edge of the building. The signal picked up by the antenna in building 1 then gets transmitted from the building 1 BDA through the donor antenna and out to the donor tower. So essentially, you're sending the signal both from your donor antenna in, say, building 2, and also through the donor antenna in building 1. So you're getting multipath back to the tower. So let's take a closer look at the building 1 and building 2 scenario. In this example, the user would be located in building 2 and be located somewhere inside the building where they're covered by the DAS. So they would key up their radio and the signal is received by a service antenna in building 2. The uplink is then transmitted through the passive DAS through the BDA in building 2 and out of the donor antenna. And that signal, the uplink signal from building 2, is received by the donor tower. At the same time, you're getting a side lobe or possibly even the main lobe of the donor antenna uplink signal transmitted from building 2 that can be received by one of the building 1 service antennas. Once received by the building 1 service antenna, it's once again transmitted through the passive DAS, through the BDA, and this time it would be a second BDA, which adds additional delay to the signal. Then amplified through, transmitted through the donor antenna and received by the donor tower. So the donor tower is seeing 2 signals, 2 identical uplink signals with potentially no difference in signal strength, received some number of microseconds apart. So the number of microseconds apart is going to be completely dependent on whether it's a Class A or Class B BDA, and if it's a Class A BDA, what the filter bandwidth is and what the delay is for that filter. So potential issues from this are going to be time delay interference or destructive interference, among other issues. So it is dependent on what radio system is deployed, whether it's P25 phase 2, phase 1, a conventional system. You could have different problems that arise based on the radio system deployed. However, it's never a good thing to have 2 equal signal strength signals going back to the tower a set number of microseconds apart. Another potential issue that could occur is going to be oscillation between buildings. So in this example does a sort of zoom in on buildings 4, 5, and 1. So let's look at this scenario. In this scenario, the downlink signal from the tower is received by building 4. The building 4 system amplifies it through and it transmits out of the service antennas. Out of the service antenna, you're covering both inside the building and you might get some signal leakage out of the building. If building 1 has low E glass on the outside, you might get a signal reflected back into the building 5 service antenna, or sorry, building 5 donor antenna. The building 5 donor antenna then receives that signal and transmits that signal back through its service antenna. Through that service antenna, you might get a reflectance back into building 4, and you sort of have a figure 8 going between the buildings, reflected off of building 1. So some people might say, okay, well, that's not that much loss, or that's way too much loss. There's no way that can happen. So let's take a very quick look at the link budget. So assuming that the downlink output of a service antenna in building 4 is, say, 0 dBm, so maybe you have some passive loss until you get to the service antenna. Your path loss to building 1 and reflected back to building 5 service antenna, let's call it 100 feet and some additional loss on top of that. We're going to call it 70 dB of loss. Then you have the Yagi antenna gain minus the transmission line loss in building 5. So you might have 8 dB of gain total. And then your measured downlink input to the BDA at building 5 from the building 4 service antenna is minus 62 dBm. So let's say we have a relatively weak off-air signal, maybe neg 65. If we have neg 65 dBm coming off air, but neg 62 coming from an adjacent building, and vice versa into the other building, we have actually no isolation. So we're at negative isolation at that point, where we are increasing our signal input to the BDA at each time. So this would immediately go into oscillation, and both the building 4 and building 5 BDAs would do a self-shutdown at this point. So it's important to know, if you have multiple buildings located right next to each other, be aware of what's going on between the buildings as well as what's going on within your own building. Because in this case, in building 4 on its own might have perfect isolation. It might have 120 dB of isolation, so you can run a BDA at max gain. But just because building 4 has good isolation doesn't mean that between building 4 and building 5 you have good isolation. That's why it's important to know as a system integrator, okay, I have building 4 here, there's building 5 also with a BDA installed. I need to be aware of that so I can deploy my system properly and not run into interference. So those are just 2 possible issues with deploying BDAs close together. Let's look at an alternative solution. The alternative solution is a FiberDAS deployment. So in the FiberDAS, we would have a master unit in, say, building 1 in this case, with the donor antenna on the roof, with underground fiber to the 4 other buildings, and remote units in the 4 other buildings. So taking a look at the first scenario where we have uplink signal retransmitted through the system, the only possible donor antenna in this scenario is in building 1. So you're not getting the retransmission of uplink signal through buildings. Looking at the other potential issue, the oscillation between buildings, we only have one downlink source, which is going to be the donor antenna through building 1. When you run an isolation test, you're already testing the isolation of the donor antenna on top of building 1 to the service antennas in buildings 1 through 5. So you're mitigating that isolation problem by having just a single donor antenna with one master unit. There are some flaws here. We do have fiber underground, and if you cut the fiber to any building, you will lose service in that building. So there's no dedicated donor antenna per building, which can be mitigated with redundancy. But regardless, whether you cut underground fiber or if you cut the donor antenna line, you sort of run into the same situation where any individual building does not have redundancy on its own. Another problem can be alarming, which is solved by using the remote units as sort of a signal booster for the building. So if you require dedicated remote enunciation in each building, you can monitor the rest of the building through the remote units and have an enunciator in, say, building 2 that monitors the donor signal received by the master unit in building 1, as well as the fiber between it, as well as the remote unit and battery backup within building 2 itself. So you're able to remotely monitor everything from any one of these buildings. So let's take a look at the comparisons between FiberDAS and individual BDAs. In terms of cost, individual BDAs are going to be cheaper to install. You get rid of the underground fiber, so you're not pulling underground, and you're adding in a master unit. So you have a master unit, you need to have someone who specializes in fiber to properly splice the fiber and test it. So your individual BDAs will always be less expensive. However, overall in the long run, it might be more expensive to deploy individual BDAs if you run into oscillating BDAs, a shutdown, or a potential fine from the FCC for transmitting too high based on your oscillation. The simplicity, for the same reasons, individual BDAs are easier to install. BDAs are the original DAS for public safety. Just throw a BDA in there and turn the gain up and walk away. However, that's not always necessarily the case, because in addition to installation, most companies who do the installation also do the commissioning. The commissioning simplicity of a FiberDAS for a campus scenario is going to be much easier. Everything is done through the building one system or through the master unit, wherever that's located, and there's only one point of uplink back to the donor tower. So it's much easier to commission, and you save a ton of time tracking down interference because there's only one potential source back to the donor tower. The FiberDAS also has a much better uplink noise floor that it produces. There's only a single uplink noise floor when you're deploying a FiberDAS. So you can mitigate any interference by looking at a single point back to the donor tower. Whereas with individual BDAs, as soon as you deploy a BDA in, say, the building next door, having two BDAs automatically increases the noise floor by 3 dB. You can increase it even more if you start oscillating between the buildings, where you can get an extreme increase in your uplink noise that you produce. Oscillation testing, for the same reason as commissioning simplicity, is much easier with the FiberDAS. You just have one master unit, you commission everything from a single head end, and then you go out to the building to do your final testing. A FiberDAS also has a much lower chance of future interference because you have one person who can see the entire system from one master unit location. Whereas with individual BDAs, maybe have system integrator 1 install the first couple BDAs and system integrator 2 install the next couple. Well, system integrator 2 doesn't know about what system integrator 1 did to begin with. So there's a huge chance that their BDAs will now interfere with the BDAs that are already installed. For the monitoring capabilities, both are equally good. A FiberDAS is flexible where you can monitor from building 1 only or from all of buildings 1 through 5, so you have the flexibility on the FiberDAS. For individual BDAs, that is as simple as it gets. Each BDA is for a single building and you monitor it individually. So it's good to compare both the overall picture as well as the cost of each individual building when deciding whether to deploy a FiberDAS or individual BDAs in a system. I recommend always looking into the full picture and working with your local jurisdiction to decide whether a FiberDAS or individual BDAs are right for your campus scenario. Thank you, and if you would like to reach out, again, this is Matt Lunny with Coma Telecom, and I'm happy to answer any questions on this.